All right, in this presentation, we're going to talk through a couple things in Hamlet Act 2 by way of review, and then dive into some concerns in Act 3, looking predominantly at the to be or not to be soliloquy. So, in Act 2, two kind of big places where Hamlet spent some time talking are to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in a monologue that we'll call the What a Piece of Work is Man monologue. By way of review, it's important to recognize that in that monologue, Hamlet is telling us these kind of two things that he's battling with at the same time. He's dealing with the subjective reality of his own experience, but then he's also qualifying it by looking at it objectively too. So these things bubble up out of his subjectivity, but objectively, he's aware that the way that he's currently seeing things is maybe not the proper way to see things. So he talks about the world fretted with majestical fire, beautiful, and yet to me, he says, it's a congregation of foul and pestilent vapors. Talking about man, people, he says, infinite in wisdom, in apprehension like a god, and yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Hamlet here is suggesting that he's in this dark period where even though he knows rationally that certain things are true about the world, he can't bring himself to see them that way because of this dark cloud he's under. So by the conclusion of the act, he spends a tremendous amount of time beating himself up at the end of the second act, referring to himself as a rogue and peasant slave, insulting himself for his hesitancy and his lack of conviction. He looks at that player who is able to work up all this emotion for Hecuba, who's nothing to him, or he to Hecuba. And yet Hamlet's like, I got a father murdered, and I cannot bring myself, even in that space, to be aligned, to have my emotion and my action kind of meet up together. At the conclusion of that soliloquy, he expresses doubt about the nature of the ghost. And we said there's a couple different ways of looking at that, and moves into Act 3 with this plan to catch the conscience of the king. So Act 3, which hopefully you're already well into, is interested in, again, Hamlet's relationships with this conflicting society. We'll see him have a conversation with Ophelia that's very important and suggests things about their relationship, but also suggests things about his view of women. And then we'll see him have a conversation at the end of the act with Gertrude, which is also poignant and necessary in our understanding of kind of what's happening with Hamlet in this. I'd like to talk a little bit about Hamlet before we even see him in the story. So we're seeing a Hamlet that is very marked by this tragedy. And we've mentioned that before, that it's important to see that he probably wasn't always like this, that prior to the death of his father, it's likely that he was a charming, courteous, and delightful person who enjoyed life and sought to embrace others in that joy. A.C. Bradley, who's a famous Shakespeare critic, says here that he was probably inclined to nervous instability, to rapid and perhaps extreme changes of feeling and mood, and that he was disposed to be, for the time, absorbed in the feeling or mood that possessed him, whether it were joyous or depressed. You get this image of a very kind of like open-spirited Hamlet. If he's with people who are happy, he's the most joyful one there. If you're a friend of his and you're upset and you're sad, he's there with you. He's sitting with you. He's engaged with you. This kind of like we can kind of see ourselves in Hamlet because his emotional palette is so broad. But now, because of this kind of emotional sensitivity that he has, and the tragedy that he's experiencing and these unique circumstances that he's experiencing, there's a darkness and a heaviness that's settling on him that Bradley seems to suggest is probably not like normal for Hamlet. He's probably not this morose or this gloomy of a Gus, the worst kind of Gus. So there's a number of places in the play that we can kind of use to point to this interpretation that Bradley gives to us. Probably most is in the second part here of just how gracious he is to people when he sees them. Horatio is his best friend. Sir, my good friend, he says when he sees him. That makes sense. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are snakes. I mean, they're fools, and Hamlet outs them as fools pretty quickly. And yet he still greets them as excellent good friends. When he sees these players in Act 2, Scene 2, they're strangers to him. I mean, he recognizes some of them. He's seen them perform before, but they're not close. And he says, "You're welcome, masters. Welcome, good friends." We have a deep sense of just this egalitarianism, this equality with which he treats everybody of high rank, of low rank. Again, Hamlet's a prince, so for him to come alongside these kind of like everyday people is a sign of his generosity and his empathy in the human condition. He's also we begin to see, certainly in the play, he's got some clear ideas about what it means to live a good life. Bradley says, nothing is to be found elsewhere in Shakespeare of quite the same kind as Hamlet's disgust at Claudius's drunkenness, his loathing of his mother's sensuality, his astonishment and horror at her shallowness, his contempt for everything pretentious or false, his indifference to everything merely external. What Bradley suggests here is Hamlet's got a clear sense of what the right thing to do is, and he rages against it when he sees people who are lying to him. Polonius, Rosencrantz, and Guildenstern. He doesn't have any stomach for it. He's not willing to give that part of himself away. He's not going to just be a pawn in other people's deception and their lies. So the way that appears so far is this antic disposition in which Hamlet is making jokes and puns and essentially trying to find some emotional relief for himself. I think, and T.S. Eliot here is sort of arguing this, that Hamlet's not he's not trying to be funny necessarily. He's not trying to be like the comedian. Instead, he's just trying to find some way to relieve the tension that he himself is feeling. He kind of reminds me of Chandler in Friends a little bit because it's just like this. He's having a hard time aligning these two realities of the deceitfulness and the lies and the pretentiousness of Denmark society. And so the way that he handles it is by just kind of poking at it and popping fun at it. And if he can do that, then maybe he can give himself at least some relief in this tension that he's having a hard time dealing with. That's a happy side of it, a Chandler side. The negative side is maybe this Edgar Allan Poe side, in which Hamlet perhaps is struggling with this real deep depression and this real deep insanity,